Alrighty, we're live. Okay, so welcome everybody again to creating the world's best yacht risk list. As I said, we're creating it. We're not quite there yet. And today we're going to be diving a little bit more into this risk analysis methodology called the bow tie. And as you can see, it's called the bow tie because it looks like a bow tie. And the point being, the knot in the middle of the bow tie is actually the event we're trying to risk manage. And this is a really great diagram because it gives you the ability to put everything on one diagram and actually deal with multiple hazardous scenarios all at one time. And what that means is when you do the analysis, you can use this for the analysis and say, we'll go through it in a second, but to say it quickly, what threats on the left side could lead to what consequences overall. And here we've got 3 coming in and we've got 3 coming out, and I haven't actually calculated the number of permutations that exist, but you can come up with multiple hazardous scenarios to do that. So this is a great starting point to look at all the factors on what could lead to, first of all, a man overboard, and then if they do go overboard, to the consequences of that: drowning, hypothermia, injuries, and then move into the hazardous scenarios and try to work out in detail the sequence of events which lead to the hazardous scenario, and then work out if our risk controls are leading to an acceptable risk profile. Okay, so hopefully that made sense, and we'll go through it today. Also, there's another thing we'll do today. I've been doing a little bit of work looking at if I can find it. Here we go, looking at risk hazard categories and hazard sources. So one thing I'm really trying to do at the moment is to be able to link all of the naming in our risk management approach together, so everything links together. And as I said, we'll deploy software into Yacht Prep, so you'll have a risk management aspect, which will actually allow you, when you look at your readiness dashboard, you can actually look at if anything is not compliant in the unready state. You can actually look at the severity of that. We'll give you the severity from our risk management to what could go wrong. So, example, well, not to give you a detailed example, but the principle is that, say you've got a defect in one flare, but you've got 20 on board, right? You've got 19 other flares. So you're probably not going to worry about that one defect, right? But if it's defect in one life raft and you don't have a backup, then, maybe you want to consider that. So that will be a higher severity non-readiness item to go through. So coming up in future videos, we'll actually use this and other techniques, some of which we looked at yesterday. And the document I'm actually using and referring to is from the American Bureau of Shipping. This is a great document. I highly recommend people reading it. Risk assessment applications for the marine and offshore industry. Now, there's a lot of really good stuff in here, but I've been doing risk management for the last 15 years in medical devices. And I have to say, I've probably gone deeper and deeper I go. And especially when you have to try and code it into software, I'm really putting a fine point on things. And so, yeah, for you, again, we'll have different abilities, different experiences out there. I think we can all understand this. But as you get into this, just take time, go through the layers, do what's useful to you. And, ideally what we're aiming for on this podcast is to make boating safer. So if we can save one life, that's great. If we can save one boat, that's great. If we can save one injury, that's great. If we can stop somebody getting scared on board, that's great too. So we're really looking for benefit to the audience. Right, so let's dive back into the to the threats, barriers, and consequences. Now, this is the diagram that's in the American Bureau of Shipping document. Going through it, it's good, don't get me wrong, but it's not complete. I think when you go through it, you'll see obvious gaps. And again, the goal at this point is not to identify the gaps. We'll get into that when we do this scenario or other scenarios in the future. But just to go through the structure first, and then we'll walk through a few paths. So the way it works is you sort of move from left to right. Now, here they call it a threat. So poor weather, ill health, inadequate equipment, for example. Another way to do that we call it a hazard, because a hazard is a potential source of harm. That's the ISO 14971 risk management, and that's more medical though. So harm, it is maybe a bit more human oriented. Where threat, for example, it does lead to a harm as well. It's just different language, but we just understand this is the potential source of harm, or in this one, the potential source of consequence. So on the left, we've got the threats. On the right, we have the consequences, but it all passes through this man overboard situation into the consequences. And we have two barriers to it happening. We've got the first barrier here, which is the prevention barrier. And I think I can draw there, the prevention barrier. So that would actually prevent the man overboard situation happening. And then we've got the recovery barrier. So this would be a man has gone overboard, or a woman, and these are all the barriers which will prevent the consequences. So that's a really nice way of looking at it. And then what we have here, we've got you could call it the overriding event. And I'm still working out what we'll call it on this podcast, but the overall situation is we're doing a personnel transfer at sea. Again, this diagram doesn't necessarily say what. It could be on a boat, it could be on a line, for example, between two ships, whatever the methodology is. It could be on a helicopter, right? But that's a general scenario. And then the actual hazard category is man overboard. So somebody falls off, pushed off, whatever happens, and they end up in the water. Excuse me. Right. So if we look at how this works, I'm going to start here with the poor weather, right? So poor weather, we have here on our risk list, which is what we're populating. The risk list is a list of all of the hazardous situations we can find out and the sequence of events which lead to those hazardous situations, and that bow tie analysis will help us identify a sequence of events. And we have a column here called use, situation, or context. So one of the things we want to think about is on our sequence of events leading to a hazardous situation, what is the context we're operating in? So for example, you could have exactly the same sequence of events, but have a very different hazardous situation. So you could be far out in the ocean, you could be close to the shore, you could be close to the shore with an offshore wind, could be close to the shore with an onshore wind, you could be close to the shore with a still water against a sandy beach. You could be with an onshore wind against cliffs with a high swell breaking, etc. So the actual context you're operating in can lead to different sort of hazardous situations and the severity of the harm and the probability of the harm. So, as we just mentioned, if you're operating off a sandy beach and you drift onto the beach, the likelihood you have, likelihood that's going to be less severe harm than if you're washed up against a cliff with an onshore breeze with breaking swell, right? So these are the sort of things we need to consider. It could be exactly the same sequence of events. I don't know, fuel filter clogs, engine stops, can't get it restarted, you run aground, but that context determines the severity of events. So here again, moving back to this, the threats, here they've got poor weather. This is somewhat our context. And what they've got here, the barriers, the preventions to man overboard is radio visual communications. And I'll have to admit, I'm not a commercial mariner. I've never done a ship transfer, but I assume that keeping a visual radio and visual communications with the ship and potentially the personnel being transferred is important. And if you lose that visibility, then potentially that increases the risk of man going overboard. And then they have another one, which is weather monitoring, which is always curious. We always monitor the weather. And usually the choice is it's very hard to outrun weather. It's very easy if you haven't left or haven't done something to actually not execute or not go out or perform a maneuver if the weather is bad. But monitoring the weather in this case potentially to pick the right time to do the transfer. And I can imagine that this could be a scenario if you're transporting people out onto an oil platform, for example. They're probably weather windows, they fly in or don't fly in, etc. But again, if you're watching this and you know about more than this than me, let us know and educate the group. So that's one. And then we've got inadequate transfer equipment. So here, barriers for prevention, the ones they've got is annual equipment certification. Now, here, inadequate could mean two things, right? Or at least two things. Could be performance. So, it's here we've got, I think, more performance related issues. It's not certified, which means there's potentially a risk that it needs a service and something could fail. And then you've got a maintenance program as well to keep it in operating condition. So that's really inadequate performance, but inadequate could potentially mean that it's missing. You don't have the right equipment for the job, which would be different barriers you have to put in place to do the man overboard. But in this case, it looks like they're talking about the actual performance of the equipment on board. And they've got an annual equipment certification, so ensuring that your certificate says it's good to use, and especially on personal boats, things like expiry dates on flares or life raft certification, not really engine certification, engine servicing, for example. Certification is different to servicing, making sure they're in place. And then we've got ill health, physical contraindications. So one here, we've got the annual physical examination. So you shouldn't be on board the ship, the commercial ship, if you don't pass the physical. And then you've got the master ultimate authority. So this is the ship master. So a ship master can say that person is not fit to do the transfer. So they can overrule it and stop either the whole transfer maneuver or stop a single person being transferred. And as captains of our ship, that's a really important power we hold. We can choose to do things or not do things under our authority. So leading to each of these could lead to a man overboard event, and actually working out the sequence of events to do that is something we're not going to do on this transfer. I'm not sure how common transfer at sea is with private boating. I think maybe in a leisure situation, kids swimming between boats, when you're anchored, this sort of thing. But in terms of, operations, underway, generally the majority of the cases, it's a sole boat just, going out for a day, going out for a week, doing a crossing, not necessarily transferring. So I'm not sure this is a great example for us as private boat owners, but we'll get onto that. So assuming that there's a path through these, through these lead to a man overboard, then we need to think about the recovery barriers. So how do you recover from that situation to avoid drowning, to avoid hypothermia, to avoid injuries? That's the question. So here they've got man overboard equipment on one side, and that's obviously different from the transfer equipment. So man overboard could be a davit, it could be a buoy, it could be a Jacob's ladder, it could be crew going with a dinghy to recover, it could be a whole bunch of things, right? So having that equipment on board so you can actually recover someone from over the side of your boat. The other one is the life jacket survival suit. So in a good transfer, you don't expect the person to be in the water, but if they do end up in the water, a life jacket always, survival suit, I guess, depends on the operating conditions of the water. And again, in cold water, definitely. In tropics, I'm not sure, but correct me if somebody knows, or inform me if somebody knows, if you're actually wearing survival suits in those situations. Potentially that's a risk, right? Because you could overheat. And then we have a rescue contingency plan, which again, I'm assuming here that the man overboard equipment doesn't work, or at least the first go doesn't work. So you've got a contingency plan, backup plan to have another go and get them on board. So interestingly here, I think these are just routes to the consequences. It's not necessarily saying that one route is leading to one consequence. It could be that, for example, so we've only got 3 columns here. So unlike the left-hand side where every bar is an individual barrier, here we just have 3 barriers, and these barriers are all going through to drowning. So drowning, hypothermia, or injuries. So I guess the logic then is that one path will lead to drowning, one path will lead to hypothermia, one path could lead to injuries. And again, yeah, it's a really subtle point. The actual sequence of events which lead to the hazardous situations we put in our risk list here, right? And we specifically say that these sequence of events lead to drowning, lead to hypothermia, lead to injury, for example. And we would have different scenarios or multiple scenarios which lead to, drowning in multiple ways, getting hypothermia in multiple ways, getting injuries in multiple ways. And that's the real art and the discipline of the risk management, to try and work out all the scenarios that could possibly happen, either through brainstorming and creativity, but also reviewing public reports of incidents and accidents. So for example, in the UK, you've got the Marine Accident Investigation Board, the US Coast Guard publishes them. Generally, every nation will have a public authority which will do public reports on incidents at sea, and they're very interesting to read. And it's also very interesting to go through them yourself and also critically think about what could happen or what else could be done. So this is just one of the many ways that we can identify hazardous scenarios, and as a first step, as an input to that, the sequence of events, and then do the risk controls on it. Okay. So as you can imagine, we touched on it last night, and I'll do a dedicated session doing the bow tie analysis to the single use events, so the one shot items we have on board, like flares, you get a one shot at it. Life raft, you get a one shot at it. A fire extinguisher, gas inflated life jackets, etc. And this is really interesting, I think, because on all those one-shot items especially, you got the barriers to prevention. Is a flare, for example, you say, is usually they come in a separate plastic wrap. Is it still in that plastic wrap, right? If it is probably in good condition. Is it still within expiry, for example? Is there any visible damage, etc.? There's a whole bunch of prevention checks you can do to make sure that all your flares on board are in good condition. But then there's also the recovery event. So if you do have one flare that doesn't work, what can you do next? Now, given these are one-shot items, usually the case is you have a mitigation by having a backup in place. With flares, I don't know what they cost, $10, $20 each. That's something you can definitely do cheaply. And same for, life jackets, not 10, $20, it's $1,000, few $1,000, depending on what you buy. But these recovery ones are definitely worth thinking through. Now, there are some other bits here which we'll go into a little bit more detail. You've got escalation controls here. So, for example, they've got escalation controls, part of weekly safety equipment checks. So just checking the equipment weekly, escalation factors, threats to barrier, equipment not available or damaged. Okay, so yeah, that's a interesting one. It's a good point, but again, I don't know why you wouldn't have it here as a threat. That sounds like a threat to me, but anyhow, that's the way they've done it. Right, so that's more or less the bow tie for personal transfer, and we'll come back to it at a future date and work through some examples. Now, here is our risk list, and it is evolving. Again, we're on stream number 8 at the moment. We've got a long way to go. We're starting to build out a list. For example, we've got about 7 risks. It's not a lot, but as we work through this again and again and again, we're starting to build quite a nice risk list. And what we're going to be working on today is taking a look at these two things, the categories, how we categorize the risks in the risk list. We'll do that. We've added the use, situation, context. We've touched on that today. We've got the sequence of events. Originally, the hazardous situation was in the sequence of events. We now have that separate because the same sequence of events could lead to different hazardous situations. And then we've got the unmitigated harms, the mitigated risk assessment, which is a combination of severity, probability, the risk controls, and then what happens after you do the risk controls. So one thing I'm trying to do to work out is, as we move forward, sort of what are the areas that we need to start thinking about as we go forward. Now, this is, I don't know what it was, an hour, 1 or 2 hours work, just to try and identify what categories we can do. I've developed this list, which is the hazard category. So asphyxiation, basically suffocation, and then the source. So an example so we can all understand it. So for example, here we've got one category, asphyxiation, but we've got 3 hazard sources, which could lead to this hazard category causing harm. So the asphyxiation here, for example, asphyxiant, so basically something that displaces the oxygen in an area. So it could be entry into a sealed water tank or petrol tank for cleaning. The oxygen is displaced by some kind of vapor. So then we've got human. So it could be known that there's an asphyxiant in there. It's an enclosed space working, and the person climbs into it without testing the atmosphere first, for example. Or they climb in without having somebody monitoring them. So these are anybody who's worked in an industrial setting will recognize some of these. And then we've got performance. Ventilation fails during confined space work in the bilge, for example. Or, performance one could be a failure. You could have an exhaust leak and your engine room fills up with CO2, for example, which maybe overcomes the crew at some point. So these are performance is basically a failure of performance. Go through a few more examples. Capsize, for example. We've got gravitational, so placing heavy things on the roof, which change the stability of the boat and basically inverts. I think that would be maybe rare if you were just in harbour, but if you were out at sea and you got hit by a wave, that's possibly a scenario. Human error, so you've got a storm coming, strong winds, and you don't reef your sail, so you're overpowered. That could be a human error. And then kinetic, so breaking quarter sea rolls her through 180 degrees, for example. So that's an external kinetic impact, which could lead to a capsize. We've got collisions, so human errors, so you don't give way when you need to, or no lookout kept. And we've already looked at the no lookout situation in recent episodes. And we've got kinetic, vessel underway, ship overtakes on a converging course at night. So it could be a visibility issue there. You get hit by something, and could be performance. So vessel underway, AIS is not transmitting, for example. So you've got like your AIS is failure. So you think you're visible to other yachts, but you're not, and you get hit, for example. Or VHF is not working, so you can't put a call out to the other ship or the other boat, and it leads to a impact. Contact, so collision is with another boat. Contact is with a stationary object, fixed or floating object. And again, you're getting the idea here. Human errors, so berthing too fast. I think we've seen lots of those videos on Instagram. Kinetic, so it could be a fixed or floating object. For example, like hitting a submerged container, log, these sort of things. And it also could be a performance issue. So, for example, your chart plotter datum offset could be wrong. Maybe the thing you hit is defective. So you've got like a buoy with a light not working. Maybe you lose your electronic navigation, and you've may or may not have the charts, but you don't know where you are. So these are performance issues. Cyber instances, that could be an interesting one. We'll probably do that more later in this series. Explosion, so lithium battery failures, LPG leaks into the bilge, and potentially an electrical spark sets it on fire. Human error, so you're refueling an outboard with engine running. You don't check for leaking gases before you start the outboard, before you start the gas stove, these sort of things. Then stored energy. So again, this is not necessarily a flammable explosion, but a pressure explosion. So it could be a dive cylinder that ruptures, for example. And we've got fire. I think people know these pretty well. You've got electrical fires. The source could come from electrical source, a flammable source, for example, gas or petrol vapor getting in contact with an ignition source. Human source, for example, a pan left unattended on the stove, a candle alight in an empty berth. I don't know why you would do candles on a boat, but these things do happen. Reaction, so this is like more a chemical reaction. Chlorine granules leak into oil can, for example. Teak oil rags heaped in a locker self-heats. Again, exothermic reaction leading to a fire event. Thermal, you leave a rag on a exhaust elbow and ignites, etc. Flooding, grounding, illness. So you can see here, these are not the hazardous situations. So at the moment, if I go to the end, I've got 60 different combinations of hazard and hazard sources, which are things that could lead to harm on the boat. And by harms, just to drive the point home, on the risk assessment, we categorize harms in terms of harm to the crew, harm to the vessel, harm to the third party property, or the environment. So there's really a lot of things that can go wrong on a boat. And to be safe, we need to manage all of them. So I think with that got through that a lot quicker than I thought. I think what we might do, because yesterday we didn't really update the risk list, what could be interesting today is now to look at, oh, excuse me, oh, sorry, it's a long day, to look at some of these single-use scenarios. So let me reduce the zoom here. Alrighty, so here, let's work on this one. We started this yesterday. What's the use situation? So the sequence of events, and this is before we separated the hazardous situation, was that we had an engine seawater intake valve erodes and the seacock cannot be closed and the bilge pump not working. So, you know, you can see here, this is probably unlikely. You've got three things failing at once. However, that said, let's look at it. It's really more for illustration at this point. So, and to be honest, on boats of a certain age, if they haven't been looked after, you do have these potentials. It may be a rare event, but these things unfortunately do happen. So basically what that means is you've got seawater leaking through your valve and you can't close the seacock and you can't pump it out because your bilge pumps are not working. So what that leads to, that's the starting event, that leads to the engine room flooding and the boat begins to sink. The crew assembles on deck and launches a life raft. The life raft doesn't inflate. The crew abandons ship in sea survival suit with no life raft, and crew is not found for 12 hours, recovered in hypothermic state, right? So the hazardous situation here is crew. Sorry, I'm just gonna undo that. Crew forced to abandon ship with no life raft. Okay. Extended exposure, extended time immersed in water. So we're going to leave it at that. So I think for the use context here, we'll say one, navigating offshore. And what that means is you're far enough from the coast that you can't swim or self-rescue to get to shore. I'm just going to say daytime. We're going to say calm seas, flat ocean, no swells, calm winds. So we're giving them good weather in this situation. What am I missing? The I don't know, sea temperature. I'll just say moderate at this point. So we're not in the tropics, we're not in the Arctic, and the air temperature moderate as well. So it's not extreme weather, but enough time in the water, you can get hypothermic in any situation. So that's situation. So extended immerse time, that's it. So here the unmitigated harm consequence is potentially hypothermia. We don't really have anything in the sequence of events which leads to a particular injury. So I think we've got hypothermia as a potential outcome. Drowning here, I mean, potentially drowning, I guess. But under those conditions, if you've got a sea suit and a life jacket on, I'm going to put that in sea suit, life jacket. with no life raft, you're probably not going to drown. So I'm just going to stick to one harm this moment, which is hypothermia. So when we look at the risk assessment, we assess that hypothermia is severe because under our one, we have injury with medical intervention. So if you have hypothermia, you need some type of medical intervention. I would probably say if you got rescued from the sea, you'd end up in the hospital somewhere. And the unmitigated probability here is, in this case, I put a unlikely. And what unlikely means, it's possible but not expected during normal operations. And here I'm not really talking about the flooding or the sinking. What I'm talking about is the life raft not inflating. So if your life raft is serviced, it should work, but anything's possible. So it is possible. And I wouldn't say it's rare, because if you take a look on the internet, you can find lots of examples of life rafts not inflating, unfortunately, for various reasons. So that is the unmitigated situation. But now it's our one-shot event. And now we're going to take a look at the, sorry, and I'll just finish off. So severe, unlikely, and from our risk matrix, we could say that's tolerable. And that's again from just the formal categorization. But if you're in that situation, the question is that really tolerable? Is that something you would tolerate? Or would you try and mitigate it down to something more acceptable, which is what we've done here. So, using sort of the bow tie kind of framework, we're saying what are preventative barriers to prevent you getting that situation, and then what are the recovery barriers. So if you do have a life raft that doesn't inflate, what what barriers could you put in place to prevent the hypothermia? So the first one we said is visual inspection. So just inspecting as much as you can from the outside, the status of the life raft, the hydrostatic release, just a general condition. Is there any damage which looks like it may have penetrated your valet or penetrated your plastic case, for example? These are always important on an ongoing basis. Ensuring your life raft is always in certification, that it's not overdue for a service. Again, that's important to make sure that the mechanism inside is still working, that your gas cylinder will still inflate. Checking the status of life raft components. This one is not so common, but I have seen how do you say, Survivitech. They had a case where one of their service agents was not actually servicing properly and didn't replace an outdated gas cylinder, and that life raft did not open when it was meant to. So you can always ask your service station for more information than they give you, and potentially get the lot number, the expiry date, etc., of the gas cylinder they put into your life raft, for example, just as a double check on their on their work. And with life rafts, this really is almost what you can do, because we're relying on the service stations to service it for us. And obviously for us, we need to make sure it's installed correctly onto the boat. But in this scenario, it's a failure in the life raft, not a failure in the installation. So then we've got the recovery barriers. So just quickly, these are the ones coming up the right-hand side. So you've got the situation where the life raft didn't inflate. And then we're trying to prevent heading to, in our case, to a hypothermic situation. And the clear one here, especially with these one event equipment, is to have a backup. So in this case, have a secondary life raft on board your boat. So the first one doesn't inflate. You've got a second one, you can have a go. So that's one mitigation. If you want to go deeper and further and more precise, you can make sure that that second life raft is from a different manufacturer, and definitely from or definitely from a service by a different service station. So again, if we take the Servitech example, there was one station in Portugal which were doing a bad job. So the probability of having two different service stations being as bad as each other is very, very low, I would say. especially, you know, my experience is dealing with these people. They know their business is about doing a good job. They know they're dealing with life-saving equipment. And I find, especially in the commercial arena, they take that job very seriously. So, you know, having two bad apples, you know, getting your life raft serviced by two equally bad service partners, I think is very, very low, for example. And if you do have the same manufacturer, same model, make sure they're from different lot numbers. So again, that's some sort of protection that, you know, if you do have a bad lot and they're all bad for some reason, and in manufacturing, these sort of things do happen, that they're both not going to fail. We also have other options here. You know, let's say, for example, your two life rafts do fail, you've got a tender on board. Okay, in these situations in calm weather, you can definitely launch your tender. Excuse me, so you're not overboard. And failing, you don't have a tender, maybe you got toys on board like kayaks or other inflatable objects which you can get out of the water. Inflatable flamingo, I don't know, but I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but anything you can do to get yourself out of the water. So the mitigated severity here, I would say, is moderate. And what that means is you might have some first aid treatment, but assuming you get rescued within a reasonable amount of time, if you're out of the water in a raft, you're probably not going to get hypothermic, especially in a survival suit. So we've said it's a moderate, and then we've said that this mitigated probability is rare. And the reason is rare is this combination of probabilities that you got a pretty low probability of one life raft not failing. And then if you compound that with a second life raft not failing, you're really getting to very low probabilities of this happening overall. So that then, according to our risk assessment, is over here. So we've got rare and we've got moderate. That puts us in the acceptable range. So, and this is always the check at the end, is after you're finishing the risk management, sit back and have a look and say, can I live with that? If I was in that situation and this occurred to me, is that something that I could live with? And for me, I'm pretty sure I could. And if two life rafts didn't inflate, then okay, maybe, God had different plans for me. Right. So I think we'll just quickly do one more scenario. Where we're 40 minutes. Yeah, we've got time to do more. Okay, so we're going to do this one here. Let's do a fire with the use of fire extinguisher. So we're going to have a look at the hazard categories. I'm just going to filter. And what have we got here? Fire. There we go. Fire. Okay, apologies. There we go. Okay. We do fire. And we'll do a flammable source. So we'll keep on to the petrol canister scenario here. So on the risk list, we're going to say the hazard category is fire, and the subcategory, and apologies, I need to update this heading because it's out of date now. We're going to say the hazard category and the hazard source. So the hazard category is fire. The source in this case is from a flammable material. I'm just going to highlight that for now so I can work out where it is. Yep, so fire, flammable material. Use situation context. I am going to copy this. So we're offshore, but in pretty mild conditions, daytime, calm seas, flat ocean, calm winds, sea temperature moderate. So potentially none of the sources of harm are going to come from our environment. It's going to be all due to on board. And here, we are going to have, for example, what can we do? Let's do a gas leak scenario. So let's say we have a LPG gas cylinder on board with a hose that it has expired, and installation does not have a current pressure test. Okay, so it's old, it's not being tested, not being maintained. We have gas leaking into bilge in kitchen area, and let's say gas detector is absent. And as you write this sort of stuff, if you're ever even a half responsible owner, you kind of see how some of these sequence of events, we're so well trained nowadays that they should not happen. We should be doing the annual test, we should be checking expiries, and most definitely we should be having gas detectors on board our boat. Then we have a situation where crew lights gas stove, and we can say explosion occurs. Okay. Now, the hazardous situation is we have a explosion. I'll say uncontrolled explosion. I mean, most explosions are uncontrolled, except for those occurring inside your engine. Explosion occurs on board, close to a crew member, right? So we've got two things there. We've got explosion on board. So you're going to have property damage. You've got close to a crew member, so you're probably going to have a crew injury here. So the unmitigated harm, we're going to say property here, fire damage to the kitchen. Oops. And then crew, we'll say 3rd-degree burns requiring hospitalization. Sorry, okay, explosion occurs. But sorry, the whole point here was we wanted to do the firefighting stage. 6. Other crew fight, deploy fire extinguisher, but it does not work. Okay, so we've got uncontrolled explosion on board, close to a crew member, fire underway, fire suppression system not working. Okay, so that is the situation. So in this situation, we're going to have fire damage to the kitchen, definitely, but if you can't get it under control, this could lead to total loss of boat due to ship. And then we got potentially 3rd-degree burns requiring hospitalization, and potentially abandonment of boat, so people have to go over the side. So in this case, again, the point of these hazardous scenarios is we're sort of just doing one mitigation at a time, and the one we're looking at here is a fire extinguisher. So we've got a sequence of events which should be mitigated, but in this hazardous scenario, we're not going to mitigate them. We'll do that in a separate one. So what we're really looking at is the last event where the fire extinguisher doesn't work. So here, I mean, I think the severity is pretty high. So I would say catastrophic, so total loss, insurance, death, permanent injury. So a 3rd-degree burn is probably going to leave significant scarring. And if you have to abandon the ship, abandon the boat, then that means you've probably lost the boat. So we're going to say catastrophic. And we'll look at the unmitigated probability. Here again, with this sort of stuff, if we assume that the fire extinguisher is in date or out of date, which is a good piece of information, apply fire extinguisher with in date certificate. Okay, that's a good build. And what we've got here then is that what is the probability of a serviced fire extinguisher not working? It's either going to be rare or either going to be rare or unlikely. So I would probably go to the unlikely case as opposed to the rare case. On your boat, you can do your own thing. And then we've got a situation where it's unlikely catastrophic, which is not tolerable. Sorry, which is unacceptable. So we go catastrophic, unlikely, and then I'll just copy this down. We've got unacceptable. Right. So here again, we're going to mitigate the fact the fire extinguisher didn't work. It had a current certificate. What checks can we do? So the prevention checks, and I'll pull up a maritime fire extinguisher. So we get a photo. So here on most fire extinguishers, if not all, you have a pressure gauge, right? So that's something we can check on our boats, which is very easy to do to make sure that our undeployed fire extinguisher has the correct pressure. So prevention could be 1, regular visual inspection of fire extinguisher pressure, right? That could be 1. 2, regular inspection to ensure tag is still in place, i.e. undeployed. So we see it hasn't been tampered with, it hasn't been deployed. And I mean, I'm just wondering what more we can do with a fire extinguisher that's in service. I guess we can do visual inspection to ensure extinguisher is undamaged. So just check the external, see it hasn't been dropped, hasn't been banged into something, you know, these sort of things. Right. Then we go the recovery. So we've worked out that our fire extinguisher doesn't work. What do we do? Here, again, I think the important one here is to have a spare fire extinguisher. Recovery have on board a backup extinguisher. That's the best one we can do. So the first one doesn't work. Hopefully the second one doesn't work. To ensure extinguisher is from a different manufacturer, lot number, serviced by different company. And again, this is the same advice. Well, sorry, it's not advice. Apologies. This is a similar risk control to what we had for the life rafts. And, you know, why not? Why not have different service providers doing the same thing? It's a good mitigation to make sure that if one is not good, the other one probably should be good. Low chance they go both can be bad. And it also gives you the opportunity to see how different companies work. So I think with those ones, just at the first pass, then the actual probability is rare. So we've gone from unlikely to rare. I think it would be rare that both extinguishers wouldn't work. And then the mitigated severity, this is important, so we can fight the fire. So potentially we're not then at this point abandoning ship, we get the fire under control. So it's probably something damage that requires major repairs. So potentially you need to replace the kitchen. We still have severe injuries. Explosion is the one that caused those injuries, so we can't stop that in this sequence of events. So we're going to go from catastrophic to severe. Oops. And the question is severe and rare, is that acceptable? So we've got severe and we've got rare. Okay, that's in the acceptable range. So we've then mitigated that down to an acceptable range. And again, if we just pass the test, would I be willing to take that risk with my fire extinguishers? I would, to have 2 fire extinguishers of the same type on board and accessible, just in case one doesn't work. I think that's a good strategy, and you're not putting 100% reliance on a critical situation on one single emergency device. Okay, so that's it for tonight. We've covered a lot. Just to cover briefly, we went through the bow tie, which is from as a risk assessment methodology, is from this American Bureau of Shipping guidance notes on risk assessment. Good document. You can search for it online or just message me and I can send you the link. We took a look at the hazard categories which we're building. So as we mentioned, we've got a hazard category and then the source of the category. So capsize, coming from human error, coming from kinetic impact, etc. And we've already identified about 60 combinations of those. So we've got a lot to do to build our world's best risk list. And then what we've done is done another 2 risks. So after, what are we on? Volume 8, we were on 8 risks. So we've got a long way to go in this series, but we're starting to build out some risk lists. And importantly, and this is the most important thing, our framework is starting to look good. And I've started working in the background on how to deploy this into yacht prep. So on our readiness dashboards in yacht prep, not only can we see why we're not ready, but we can also assess the risk impact of that readiness criteria not being met on our yacht, and then put a plan in place to make sure that our boats are what we want when we go to sea. So thanks everyone for watching. I'll be back on tomorrow, and I'm back on like sort of 3 or 4 nights a week. So just keep an eye out. Help me out if you like this at all, or if you don't like it and you see potential for it to get better, do give me a like and subscription. That really helps a lot. And I really wish everybody a great weekend on their boats. Have a good night.